The existence of our public broadcaster depends on a single line in the budget. I'm proposing that we remove the decision-making around funding from the political cycles, whether it's the elections or the budget. Many countries around the world have chosen that path in giving their public broadcaster predictable, viable, and stable funding. CBC does not belong to the Liberals, it does not belong to the Conservatives, and it does not belong to any other political parties. It belongs to the Canadian people. And this is why, to be able to give CBC Radio-Canada the means to fulfill its mandate, I propose that it be financed directly in the legislation instead of in the budget through statutory appropriation. Statutory appropriation should be based on the demographic reality. And I mean by that a per capita funding based formula. The average funding for a public broadcaster in a G7 country is $62 per person per year. In Canada, we're second to last, with $33 per year per person. We're closer to the United States than to any other country of the G7 country. And I don't think that we want the United States to be our reference. I think we need to aim closer to the middle ground, which is $62 per year per person. With predictable, stable funding based on a per capita formula, there's no reason why people would need to pay to be subscribed to one or the other platforms of the CBC. And this is why that with this change in how the public broadcaster is being financially supported, I'm also proposing that all platforms be made free and accessible to all Canadians who shouldn't have to pay twice for the service. The advertising or the search for advertising revenue is incompatible with the information mission of the CBC Radio-Canada. And by giving it a sustainable and predictable public funding, I'm proposing that there is no longer any advertisement on anything related to news or public affairs on any of the platforms of the CBC, whether it's television, radio, or online platforms. This would also free up advertisement dollars for the private sector. There have been many major national emergencies in the past years, including wildfires. Let's think about Jasper. Canadians need to have access to reliable, factual sources of information that are available across the country and not be misled by false information during those emergency situations. CBC Radio-Canada, by virtue of its size and geographic reach, must have a clear mandate to disseminate this information using its infrastructure, whether it's radio, TV, or web. So I'm proposing that we anchor that new role directly in the legislation, the role that CBC must play in case of national emergencies. Enshrined in law, the role that CBC Radio-Canada plays in the fight against disinformation to support the public, especially in the current context. And this refers directly to some of the recommendations that were made by the Foreign Interference Commission, which repeated how important it is that Canadians can rely on Canadian sources of information to be more resilient and to understand the patterns that other countries use to disseminate propaganda or disinformation to influence how we live together and our political context. And this is why I propose to anchor in CBC Radio-Canada's mandate its role in helping the Canadian population fight against disinformation and understand fact-based information. CBC has the obligation to innovate and be present with different technologies. However, I do think that CBC should have a responsibility to be more open and transparent about the use of their technology, whether it's about data, whether it's about algorithms, whether it's about being a better partner to their private collaborators, to the public sector in general, or to researchers. And I do think that the CBC can play the same role that they've played in the journalistic sectors decades ago by raising the standards and making sure that the journalistic standards are the best at the CBC and putting the standard for all the other media in Canada. I think that they should play that role with technologies and have the best ethics and rules against the use of those technologies and the private information of the citizens. Everything that I said previously around the funding of the CBC or around its mission and its mandate makes sense only if Canadians trust the CBC. And that's why I'm proposing some changes around its governance to implement the highest standards that we see around public broadcasters around the world. The first one is to change the way that the CEO is nominated. Instead of being nominated by the government, I'm proposing that the CEO be nominated by the board because the CEO is accountable to its board and to the Canadian population and not to any government. And we need to make sure that there is no perception that the CEO refers to any government when it comes to managing the public broadcaster. I'm also proposing that their salary be fixed by the board inside of the guidelines of the public service. 78% of the Canadian population supports the CBC, but want it to be better and want to be connected with their public broadcaster. This is one of the critiques that we consistently hear. Some people feel that the public broadcaster is too opaque and far from their reality and their needs. This is why I'm proposing that we include in the legislation the obligation for the public broadcaster to consult the Canadian population and also all of its partners and indicate in their activity report or in their strategic plans how those consultations influence their decision-making process and how they determine the priorities in which they're going to invest. The amended act would require CBC Radio-Canada to develop a strategy in collaboration with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities to ensure their needs are reflected in its activities. Within 3 years of the adoption of the proposed legislative amendments, CBC Radio-Canada would be required to report publicly on the co-development process and its results and how it plans to integrate the results into its activities. The Indigenous strategy that CBC Radio-Canada has in place for 2024 reflects its current mandate and circumstances. This new strategy would ensure that the needs of Indigenous peoples are taken into consideration as the corporation adjusts to changes in its mandate, governance, and funding levels. So it's already established in the legislation that the French service and English service are independent when it comes to its programming and to the obligation that the public broadcaster has to reflect both official languages realities. But right now, there's only one committee overviewing those requirements, and I do think that it should be specified in the legislation that it takes 2 committees, one for the French service and one for the English service. Supporting our public broadcaster is not a question of the political left or right. It's not a liberal or a conservative issue. It is, above all, a commitment to ourselves, our culture, and our independence. You cannot say you love Canada and yet pledge to destroy our public broadcaster that is central in telling the stories of our country. Pierre Poilievre doesn't know what it means to put Canada first, or else he would choose to protect a Canadian institution that belongs to Canadians and exists for Canadians. CBC Radio-Canada will never belong to billionaire tech oligarchs like Musk or Zuckerberg. It will always belong to the people of Canada. Merci beaucoup.